The humid air of the Philippine jungle hung thick on the morning of December 8, 1941, as Private First Class William Henderson of the 31st Infantry Regiment settled into his foxhole outside Manila. The 23-year-old farm boy from Iowa wiped condensation from his rifle scope, confident that any conflict with the forces approaching from the north would be brief. After all, everyone knew the enemy's equipment was inferior, their training inadequate. What Henderson could not know, as he adjusted his position beneath the tangled canopy of vines and mahogany trees, was that a discarded soup can, and his own desperate ingenuity, would transform him from an anonymous rifleman into a legend whispered about in both American and opposing military circles for decades to come. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 4 months, this unassuming soldier would use nothing more than scavenged materials, his marksmanship training, and an accidental discovery to delay an entire company's advance through the Bataan Peninsula, proving that even in mechanized modern conflict, individual innovation could shift the balance of tactical engagements. The initial days of the conflict in the Philippines shattered American assumptions with brutal efficiency. Henderson's regiment, part of the Combined Defense Force under General Douglas MacArthur, found itself pushed steadily southward from superior positions as wave after wave of opposing forces advanced with unexpected coordination and equipment quality. By mid-December, Henderson's company had been reduced from 147 men to 63 effectives, their retreat a grinding series of defensive actions through terrain that seemed designed to swallow entire units whole. Technical Sergeant James Morrison, Henderson's platoon leader, kept meticulous records even during the chaos of withdrawal. His diary, recovered after liberation in 1945, painted a picture of systematic degradation. Rations had been cut to half portions by December 20th. Ammunition resupply became sporadic after Christmas. Medical supplies vanished entirely by the new year. The men of the 31st Infantry were learning the harsh mathematics of industrial warfare. Their opponents possessed not just numerical superiority, but the logistical infrastructure to maintain pressure indefinitely. Henderson himself rarely spoke during those weeks. His fellow soldiers noted his increasing isolation, the way he studied the jungle with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Where others saw impenetrable green walls, Henderson began to perceive patterns, routes, opportunities. His background hunting white-tailed deer in the hardwood forests of Iowa translated imperfectly but usefully to this alien environment. He noticed how sound traveled differently at different times of day, how moisture affected visibility, how the enemy patrols moved with predictable rhythms despite their tactical proficiency. The soup can incident occurred on January 15, 1942, during a particularly desperate rearguard action near the village of Abu Kai. Henderson's squad had been tasked with holding a trail junction for 6 hours to allow the main body to establish a new defensive line 3 kilometers south. They had 42 rounds of ammunition per man, no machine gun support, and orders to avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. Corporal Eddie Martinez, a veteran of the peacetime army who'd spent 5 years in the Philippines, was heating water for coffee using an empty Campbell's tomato soup can salvaged from abandoned supplies. The can sat balanced on 3 stones over a small, smokeless fire. Henderson watched absently as Martinez poured the hot water, then tossed the can aside. It landed upright in the soft earth, its red label still visible despite mud spatters. What happened next, Henderson would later describe as pure accident, married to desperate observation. An enemy patrol, 6 men moving in loose column formation, passed within 20 meters of the Americans' hidden position. The point man's boot struck the soup can, sending it clattering against a fallen log. The metallic sound, sharp, unnatural, utterly wrong for the jungle environment, caused the entire patrol to freeze. Henderson watched through his scope as the enemy soldiers reacted with trained caution. They didn't panic, but they did exactly what their doctrine prescribed. They took cover, scanned for threats, and signaled for their trailing elements to halt. For nearly 8 minutes, the patrol remained static, focused on the area around that incongruous soup can, believing it might indicate an American position, a booby trap, or some other threat. 8 minutes. Henderson's mind began working through the implications. Sound discipline was paramount in jungle conflict. Both sides knew this. But what if you could weaponize the enemy's own caution? What if you could create ambiguous threats that forced them to slow down, investigate, waste time and energy on phantom dangers? That afternoon, Henderson approached Sergeant Morrison with a proposal that must have sounded insane. He wanted permission to operate independently behind the main defensive line, with a specific and unusual supply request: tin cans, wire, anything that could create unexpected noise. Morrison, reading the desperation in Henderson's eyes, but also recognizing the sharp intelligence that had made him the company's best marksman, agreed to a 72-hour trial. Henderson's personal war began on January 18th. He carried his M1903 Springfield rifle, 100 rounds of ammunition, a canteen, some rice, and a burlap sack filled with scavenged cans, pots, and metal fragments. His area of operations was a roughly 2-square-kilometer section of jungle through which 3 major trails converged, trails the opposing forces would need to use for their advance. His first installation was crude but effective. Henderson strung wire across a trail at ankle height, attaching several condensed milk cans filled with pebbles. When the morning patrol triggered it, the resulting clatter sent them diving for cover. Henderson, positioned 70 meters away in a carefully prepared hide, watched through his scope. The patrol leader deployed his men in a defensive perimeter, sent scouts forward, and burned 20 minutes searching for an ambush that didn't exist. But Henderson didn't just create noise traps. That would have been too simple, too predictable. He began to vary his tactics with almost scientific precision, creating a taxonomy of psychological pressure. Some traps made noise, others were silent but visible, pieces of American equipment positioned to suggest an observation post or sniper hide. Still others combined elements, a can trap that, when triggered, would cause movement in the foliage 60 meters away as the wire pulled on tied branches. Private Daniel Kowalski, one of the few men Morrison allowed to maintain contact with Henderson, later testified to Marine Corps investigators about the evolution of Henderson's methods. According to Kowalski's account, Henderson treated the jungle as a 3-dimensional chessboard. He memorized patrol schedules with uncanny accuracy, noting that the enemy forces rotated through their routes with military precision. A patrol that took Trail Alpha at 0600 on Monday would take it at the same time on Thursday. This predictability became their vulnerability. By late January, Henderson had expanded his operation. He'd created what he called interrupt zones, areas where opposing patrols could expect to encounter some form of disturbance every 100 to 150 meters. A can trap here, a deliberately broken branch pattern there, an American ration wrapper positioned to be visible from the trail. Each element was designed to create doubt, to force the enemy to slow down, investigate, report. The psychological impact exceeded any reasonable expectation. Captain Yoshiro Tanaka, whose company was assigned to this sector, wrote in his official report, later captured at Batan's Fall, about the maddening delays. His patrols, which should have been covering 5 to 6 kilometers per day, were achieving barely 2. His men reported increasing tension, the constant expectation of ambush. 3 soldiers had accidentally discharged their weapons after being startled by Henderson's installations. Morale was suffering. What made Henderson's campaign particularly effective was his selective use of actual violence. He didn't attack every patrol. He couldn't. He simply didn't have enough ammunition. Instead, he chose his moments with surgical precision. A patrol that had been harried by 3 or 4 noise traps, their nerves already frayed, would round a bend to find Henderson waiting at extreme range. 1 shot, 1 target, then silence as Henderson displaced to a pre-planned position hundreds of meters away. The pattern created a paranoid calculus. Every disturbance might be a trap, or it might precede an actual attack. There was no way to distinguish between Henderson's psychological operations and genuine threats. Captain Tanaka's solution was to slow down even further, to treat every anomaly as potentially lethal. His company's advance, which should have reached the main American defensive line by January 25th, was still struggling through Henderson's jungle gauntlet on February 3rd. But the cost to Henderson himself was mounting in ways that wouldn't become apparent until later. Corporal Martinez, delivering supplies every 4 days, noticed the changes. Henderson had lost perhaps 20 pounds from his already lean frame. His hands shook slightly when not holding his rifle. He spoke in clipped sentences, his eyes constantly scanning the jungle even during their brief meetings. The isolation was corrosive, the constant alertness draining him in ways that simple fatigue couldn't explain. The records show that between January 18th and February 10th, Henderson fired exactly 47 rounds in anger. Each shot was a confirmed impact at ranges varying from 180 to 400 meters, a testament to his marksmanship and patience. But those 47 rounds delayed an entire company for 23 days. The mathematics were staggering. One man, with laughably limited resources, had achieved what an entire platoon in conventional defensive positions might have struggled to accomplish. The opposing military leadership eventually adapted, as professional soldiers always do. By mid-February, Captain Tanaka had implemented a counter-strategy, overwhelming force on narrow fronts. Instead of using patrol-sized elements, he began pushing entire platoons through single trails, accepting the inefficiency in exchange for the psychological security of numbers. Henderson's traps became annoyances rather than showstoppers when 40 men encountered them simultaneously. Henderson recognized the shift immediately. On February 14th, he left a message with Corporal Martinez. He was changing tactics. If large formations were now the norm, he would target their vulnerabilities, specifically their command structure. What followed was perhaps the most audacious phase of Henderson's private conflict. He began studying the larger formations through his scope, identifying officers and senior enlisted leaders by their position in formation, the deference shown by others, their equipment. Then he would track these formations for hours, sometimes days, learning routes and schedules. When the perfect moment arrived, usually during the midday heat when alertness flagged, Henderson would engage from extreme range, targeting a single individual before vanishing. Lieutenant Robert Chen of the 45th Infantry Regiment, who operated in an adjacent sector, heard about Henderson's exploits through the military grapevine. His diary entry from February 20th describes meeting Henderson during a chance encounter at a water point. Chen wrote, "He looked like something the jungle had digested and spit out. Hollow-eyed, sunburned through dirt, his uniform more patches than original fabric. But when he talked about the enemy patrol patterns, his voice had this weird precision, like he was discussing train schedules instead of men trying to pursue him. He'd turned hunting humans into a science, and I think it was eating him alive from the inside." The turning point came on February 23rd. Henderson had been tracking a company-sized formation for 3 days, noting their rest stops, their patrol deployments, their morning routines. He'd identified the company commander by his distinctive leather map case and the radio operator, who stayed constantly at his side. On the morning of the 23rd, this formation paused at a trail junction Henderson had thoroughly reconnoitered. The commander and 3 other officers gathered around a map, planning their route. Henderson was positioned 290 meters away, elevated on a slight ridge. The shot was at the extreme edge of his capability with the Springfield's iron sights, complicated by heat shimmer and intervening vegetation. He controlled his breathing, calculated the holdover, and pressed the trigger. The company commander fell, struck in the chest. The formation erupted into chaos, not panic, but the controlled chaos of trained soldiers responding to sniper fire. They immediately sought cover, established a perimeter, and began attempting to locate the shooter. But Henderson was already moving, using a withdrawal route he'd prepared days earlier, complete with false trails and deliberate confusion points. The impact of that single shot rippled through the entire sector. Captain Tanaka's report from February 25th describes emergency command consultations, a complete review of patrol procedures, and explicit orders from higher headquarters to neutralize the sniper who was disrupting operations across a 5-kilometer front. 3 companies were tasked with the mission, nearly 600 men to find and eliminate 1 American soldier. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so desperate. Henderson had become valuable precisely because the opposing forces had assigned him such value. Every soldier diverted to hunt him was a soldier not pressuring the main American defensive line. Every hour spent searching the jungle was an hour of delayed advance. Henderson had transformed himself into a strategic asset through sheer audacity and the enemy's own force multiplication. But the net was closing. By early March, Henderson was operating in an increasingly restricted area. The opposing forces had begun using tracker dogs, a development that terrified him more than any conventional tactical evolution. Corporal Martinez's final resupply run, on March 8th, found Henderson in a state of near collapse. He'd been moving constantly for 48 hours, staying ahead of pursuit. His ammunition was down to 11 rounds. Food was gone. He was surviving on water and whatever grubs and roots he could identify as non-poisonous. Martinez tried to convince Henderson to withdraw to the main line, but Henderson refused. He'd identified a pattern in the search operations, a gap in coverage that appeared every third day when units rotated. He had a plan for one final action, something that would justify the entire campaign. Martinez, recognizing the fever-bright determination in Henderson's eyes, left him the remaining supplies and hiked back to friendly lines. Henderson's final engagement occurred on March 11, 1942, at a location designated on maps as Hill 227. Intelligence reports had identified this position as a staging area for a major offensive against the Bataan defensive line. Henderson, operating on pure instinct and exhaustion, had worked his way to within 400 meters of the hill's summit, where opposing forces had established a command post. Through his scope, Henderson observed what appeared to be a high-level planning session. Maps were spread on a table, radio antennas indicated communication with higher headquarters, and the quality of equipment suggested senior officers. Henderson had 6 rounds remaining. The range was at the absolute limit of his weapon's effective engagement distance. Wind was gusting unpredictably. His hands were shaking from hunger and fatigue. He took the shot anyway. Then a second, then a third, working the Springfield's bolt action with mechanical efficiency, born of thousands of practice repetitions. The results were impossible to assess definitively. The distance was too great, the confusion too immediate. But Henderson saw figures dropping, saw the command post erupt into frantic activity, saw the careful organization dissolve into reactive scrambling. Then Henderson did something that surprised even himself. He stood up, rifle still in hand, and began walking toward friendly lines. Not running, not hiding, walking. Later, he told investigators that he simply had nothing left. No ammunition, no food, no energy for evasion. If they caught him, they caught him. He was done. What happened next entered the realm of unlikely fortune. Henderson walked for 6 hours through territory theoretically controlled by opposing forces. He should have been captured or worse. But the jungle that had been his ally now provided one final service. The terrain was so broken, the vegetation so dense, that he passed within meters of enemy positions without being observed. Exhaustion had pushed him into a state beyond fear, beyond caution. He simply walked. He stumbled into American lines near the village of Bagak at 1800 hours on March 11th. The sentries almost engaged him before recognizing his uniform beneath the accumulated filth. Henderson was evacuated to a field hospital where doctors found him 43 pounds lighter than his enlistment weight, suffering from malnutrition, dehydration, infected cuts, and what they noted as acute nervous exhaustion. The story might have ended there, one soldier's remarkable but ultimately small-scale contribution to a doomed defensive campaign. But military intelligence had been tracking the effects of Henderson's operation through captured documents and interrogations. When they compiled the data, the scope of his impact became clear. Major Thomas Bradford, the intelligence officer who conducted the post-action analysis, documented his findings in a report that would later influence American sniper doctrine. According to Bradford's calculations, Henderson's 54-day independent operation had delayed the advance of 3 enemy companies by an estimated 18 to 23 days. More significantly, his actions had forced the diversion of approximately 600 to 800 soldiers to counter sniper operations, removing them from offensive duties during a critical phase of the campaign. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the psychological dimension. Interrogations of captured soldiers revealed a persistent fear of American snipers that dated to Henderson's campaign. Patrol leaders had developed elaborate procedures for dealing with potential sniper positions, procedures that slowed movements and consumed resources. The mythology of the ghost sniper who could be everywhere and nowhere had taken root, affecting morale and decision-making far beyond Henderson's actual operational area. Henderson himself recovered physically within weeks, but the psychological recovery took longer. He was evacuated to Australia in April 1942, just before Batan's fall. He spent 3 months in a hospital outside Brisbane, being treated for what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but which was then labeled simply as combat fatigue. Lieutenant Chen, who also escaped the Philippines, visited Henderson during his hospitalization. His diary entry from May 6, 1942, provides insight into Henderson's state of mind. Quote, "Willie doesn't talk about the jungle much. When he does, it's all technical. Angles, distances, timing, like he's discussing carpentry instead of the most intense experience of his life. But at night, the nurses say he doesn't sleep well. He keeps his rifle close even though it's not loaded. I think part of him is still out there waiting for the next patrol." End quote. The military, recognizing both Henderson's value and his fragility, made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of returning him to combat, they assigned him to training duty. Henderson spent the remainder of the conflict teaching marksmanship and fieldcraft to replacement troops in Australia and later in New Guinea. Thousands of soldiers passed through his courses, learning not just how to shoot, but how to think like Henderson had thought, to see terrain as opportunity, to use the enemy's own professionalism against them, to understand that individual initiative could magnify force beyond any reasonable calculation. One of Henderson's students was Private James Wilson, who later served with the famed Alamo Scouts. Wilson's memoir, published in 1987, includes a description of Henderson as an instructor. Quote, "He taught us that every sound means something, every movement creates opportunity, but he also taught us the cost. I remember him saying that being alone in enemy territory changes you in ways you can't predict. It makes you see patterns everywhere, trust nothing, expect betrayal from the landscape itself. He was teaching us to be effective, but he was also warning us about what effectiveness would cost." End quote. After the conflict ended, Henderson returned to Iowa, to the farm where he'd grown up. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and ran a successful agricultural operation. To his neighbors, he was simply Bill Henderson, a veteran who didn't talk much about his service. He attended church regularly, served on the county agricultural board, and lived what appeared to be a thoroughly ordinary post-war life. But those who knew him well noticed the quirks. He couldn't stand having his back to open spaces. He positioned his chair at restaurants to face the entrance. He went for long walks in the woods behind his property, sometimes for hours, always alone. His wife once mentioned to their daughter that Bill slept lightly, that unexpected sounds would bring him fully awake in seconds, alert in ways that seemed disconnected from a quiet Iowa farmhouse. Henderson gave only one public interview about his wartime service to a local newspaper in 1978. The reporter, expecting war stories and heroic tales, was disappointed by Henderson's reticence. Most of his answers were monosyllabic, but toward the end of the interview, the reporter asked if Henderson was proud of what he'd accomplished in the Philippines. Henderson's answer, printed verbatim, was revealing. Quote, "Proud isn't the right word. I did what circumstances required. I used what I had available. The soup can was an accident, but recognizing its potential wasn't. I suppose I proved that one person with clarity of purpose can affect events beyond their apparent capacity. But I also learned that there's a price for that kind of focus. You become the thing you're doing. You lose the boundaries between the task and yourself. I was effective because I stopped being Private Henderson and became just the mission. Getting myself back afterward, that was harder than anything I did in that jungle." End quote. The military's official recognition of Henderson's service evolved over decades. Initially, he received a Bronze Star for valor, a standard decoration that hardly reflected the scope of his achievement. But as military historians began examining the Philippine campaign in greater detail, Henderson's operation attracted increasing attention. In 1991, nearly 50 years after the events, the Army upgraded his decoration to a Silver Star, citing his extraordinary individual initiative and the strategic impact of his actions. The citation, written with access to both American and captured records, noted that Henderson's operation represented one of the most effective uses of limited resources in modern military history. One soldier with a bolt-action rifle and improvised equipment had achieved effects typically associated with specialized units, orders of magnitude larger. The citation specifically mentioned the soup can incident as an example of creative tactical thinking under extreme pressure. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. In 2003, a Japanese military historian named Dr. Hiroshi Yamamoto published a study of the Philippine campaign. Yamamoto had access to recently declassified records, including Captain Tanaka's detailed reports. In his book, Yamamoto devoted an entire chapter to what he called the ghost sniper of Bataan, piecing together the opposing perspective on Henderson's operation. According to Yamamoto's research, Henderson had become almost mythical in contemporary accounts. Frontline reports described him as multiple snipers working in coordination, or as a specially trained operative with access to sophisticated equipment. The reality that he was a single farm boy from Iowa with standard infantry kit and salvaged tin cans was almost too improbable to accept. Tanaka's final report on the matter, written in March 1942, concluded that neutralizing Henderson required disproportionate resources and that his operational methods should be studied for potential adoption. The irony that Henderson's tactics were being recommended for adoption by the forces he'd fought against would have amused him. War, he'd learned, was ultimately about effectiveness, not ideology. Good ideas transcended allegiance. The soup can trap. The psychological manipulation. The patient observation. These were universal principles that any competent soldier could employ, given the right circumstances and sufficient desperation. Henderson passed away in 2007 at the age of 89, surrounded by family in the same Iowa farmhouse where he'd lived for 6 decades. His obituary in the county newspaper mentioned his military service, but devoted more space to his agricultural achievements and community involvement. Those who attended his funeral saw a simple veteran, a farmer, a father and grandfather. Few understood the complexity of the man being eulogized, the teenager who'd become a ghost in the jungle, the hunter who'd turned psychological warfare into an art form, the soldier who'd proved that individual human ingenuity remained relevant even in the age of mechanized conflict. His grandson, Michael Henderson, later donated William's service records and personal effects to the Army Heritage and Education Center in Pennsylvania. Among the items was a battered soup can, carefully preserved despite its apparent lack of value. Michael included a note explaining that his grandfather had kept this can for 65 years, displayed on a shelf in his workshop. When asked about it, William would simply say it reminded him that solutions often come from unexpected places, that value isn't always obvious, that sometimes the most important thing is just paying attention. The strategic implications of Henderson's operation extended far beyond his personal story. Military analysts studying the campaign recognized that he demonstrated principles that would become central to modern irregular warfare. The use of psychological operations, the force multiplication achievable through creative tactics, the importance of understanding enemy doctrine well enough to exploit it, all these concepts were present in Henderson's instinctive approach. Special operations units, particularly Army Rangers and Marine Scout snipers, incorporated Henderson's story into their training curricula. Not as a template to be copied, the specific circumstances of the Philippine jungle were unique, but as an example of the mindset they wanted to cultivate. Students learned to see Henderson not as a superhuman figure, but as an ordinary soldier who'd made extraordinary choices when faced with impossible circumstances. The soup can itself, that mundane artifact that triggered Henderson's revelation, became a symbol in military education circles. It represented the idea that tactical innovation often comes from noticing what others overlook, from seeing potential in the commonplace, from understanding that the enemy's assumptions could become his vulnerability. Instructors used the story to challenge students to think beyond conventional solutions, to consider how limited resources might be leveraged creatively. But the story also carried warnings. Henderson's psychological cost, his difficulty reintegrating after the conflict, his lifelong vigilance. These elements reminded military educators that effectiveness in extreme circumstances came with consequences. Modern training incorporated psychological support and rotation policies, partially informed by cases like Henderson's, recognizing that the human mind wasn't designed for sustained solo operations in hostile territory. In recent years, historians have debated Henderson's place in the broader narrative of the Pacific Theater. Some argue that his individual contribution, while remarkable, was ultimately marginal to the strategic outcome. The Philippines fell regardless of his efforts. Others contend that his value lay not in altering the campaign's conclusion, but in demonstrating principles that would inform Allied operations throughout the remainder of the conflict. Perhaps the most balanced assessment comes from military historian Dr. Sarah Mitchell, whose 2015 study of irregular operations in the Pacific includes extensive analysis of Henderson's campaign. Mitchell argues that Henderson's significance lies in what he revealed about the nature of modern warfare, that industrial capacity and numerical superiority, while crucial, could still be disrupted by imaginative individuals exploiting tactical opportunities. Quote, Henderson proved that the mechanization of warfare hadn't eliminated the human element. It had merely changed the context in which individual initiative operated. His soup can trap was low-tech asymmetric warfare before that term entered common usage. End quote. The lessons from Henderson's experience continue to resonate in contemporary military thinking. In an era of precision munitions and network-centric warfare, the principle he demonstrated, that understanding your enemy's patterns and psychology could magnify limited force, remains fundamentally valid. Modern doctrine emphasizes the kind of observational patience, creative thinking, and willingness to improvise that Henderson embodied during those 54 days in the Philippine jungle. For the men who fought alongside Henderson, who supplied him, who heard the reports of his activities, he represented something beyond tactical success. He was proof that individual soldiers mattered, that one person's determination could affect the larger struggle, that courage and creativity weren't obsolete in industrialized conflict. In the dark months of early 1942, when Allied forces were being systematically defeated across the Pacific, Henderson's operation provided a counterpoint, small-scale, limited, ultimately insufficient to change the strategic picture, but psychologically vital as evidence that Americans could adapt, could fight effectively, could win individual engagements even when losing the larger campaign. The final assessment of Henderson's operation might best come from the man himself. In a private letter to Sergeant Morrison, written in 1953 but not discovered until after both men had passed, Henderson reflected on his jungle campaign. Quote, I've had years to think about those months. People who know the story sometimes call me a hero. I don't feel like one. I feel like a hunter who got pushed into territory he didn't understand and had to figure out survival on the fly. The soup can thing, the traps, the psychological pressure, that was all just trying to even odds that were impossibly against me. I succeeded because I focused on the immediate, the achievable. I couldn't win the campaign, couldn't save Bataan, couldn't even definitively stop one enemy company, but I could make their day harder. I could make them cautious. I could buy time measured in hours and days. That was enough because it had to be enough. I think that's the lesson, if there is one. You do what you can with what you have where you are. Sometimes it matters more than you realize. End quote. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.